Guten Tag, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, zu unserem heutigen Webinar im Energiestudio, in dem wir auf den aktuellen Gas Market Report der Internationalen Energieagentur blicken. Wir sehen dabei einen globalen Gasmarkt, der sich binnen weniger Monate grundlegend verändert hat. Mein Name ist Charlie Grüneberg und ich leite die Kommunikation bei die Gas- und Wasserstoffwirtschaft. Noch zu Jahresbeginn deutete vieles auf eine allmähliche Entspannung hin. Neue LNG-Kapazitäten gingen in Betrieb, zusätzliche Mengen kamen auf den Markt und die Preise hatten sich gegenüber den Krisenjahren normalisiert. Der Konflikt im Nahen Osten hat diese Entwicklung abrupt unterbrochen. Mit der faktischen Schließung der Straße von Hormus fiel eine Route aus, über die zuvor fast 20% des weltweiten LNG-Angebots transportiert wurde. Die Folgen: starke Preisschwankungen, umgeleitete Ladungen und sinkende Nachfrage. Das Interimsabkommen von Mitte Juni hat die Lage zwischenzeitlich etwas entspannt, doch der Verkehr durch die Meerenge bleibt auch vor Aufnahme der jüngsten Kampfhandlungen deutlich unter dem Vorkriegsniveau. Der Report analysiert vor diesem Hintergrund das erste Halbjahr 2026 und die Folgen für LNG, Speicherindustrie, Stromerzeugung und Düngemittelmärkte. Für Europa und Deutschland stellen sich damit konkrete Fragen: Wie belastbar ist die Versorgung im Winter? Reichen die Marktanreize zum Befüllen der Speicher? Und ist die erwartete LNG-Entspannung noch realistisch? Dazu begrüße ich auch heute wieder Gergely Mollner und Frederik Ritter von der IEA. Beide gehören zu den Hauptautoren des Reports und führen uns durch die zentralen Ergebnisse und Annahmen. Wir zeichnen das Ganze als Zoom-Konferenz auf. Die Aufzeichnung ist im Nachgang abrufbar, ebenso die Präsentationen. Leider müssen Gergely und Frederik nach ihrer Präsentation heute einen harten Schnitt machen, weil sie wegen diverser Anschlusstermine nicht mehr für Fragen und Antworten zur Verfügung stehen können. Wenn Sie eine dringende Frage haben, dann schreiben Sie uns eine E-Mail, dann versuchen wir einfach im Nachgang Ihnen da nochmal Antworten zu geben. And now we'll switch to English. Welcome back, Gergely and Frederik. We are very glad to have you with us. This edition is markedly different from the previous report. Instead of gradual easing, it analyzes a major supply shock whose effects extend into power generation, industry, fertilizer markets, and storage policy. The outlook also rests on a crucial assumption that the Strait of Hormuz fully reopens in Q3 and that undamaged Gulf facilities return to full operations by early Q4. We will certainly return to that point later. But first, please guide us through the key findings and what they mean for the second half of 2026. Gergely and Frederik, the floor is yours.
Charlie, thank you so much for your kind words of introduction, and indeed it is a great pleasure to be here today. My name is Gergely Mollner, gas analyst at the International Energy Agency, where I coordinate our short and medium-term market analysis. And today I have the great pleasure to be joined by my colleague Frederik Ritter to present the findings of our latest quarterly gas report, which had been published last week and is available free of charge on our website, iea.org. As you can see, the cover of the report is very, very bluish, and blue is, of course, the color of natural gas, but it is also the color of hope, and this represents our hope that this conflict will end as soon as possible, and this is very much needed to reduce first and foremost the suffering of the people, and also to allow smooth flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz. Today's presentation we have three sections. First, we will discuss the implications of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz on natural gas and LNG markets. In the second part, we will share our short-term outlook for 2026. And then in the third part, Frederik will guide us through the implications on the Asian markets, which have been the most impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that one question is, how significant is this crisis? And on this chart, we are showing some of the supply and demand factors which have been influencing price formation over the March and June period. If you look at the first bar, we are showing that loadings from Qatar and Emirates fell by approximately 35 billion cubic meters compared to last year. And of course, this is an unprecedented supply shock for the global LNG market. To put this number into perspective, this 35 billion cubic meters, this roughly equates to 45% of Germany's annual natural gas consumption. So it is indeed a major supply shock. But the good news is that about 2/3 of this decline have been offset by a very strong increase in non-Gulf LNG production coming from other producing regions, including the United States, Canada, and Africa. And this is partly driven by new LNG liquefaction capacity. And here, just to name a few, Plaquemines, Golden Pass, Corpus Christi Stage 3, as well as LNG Canada and some new projects in Africa, which are contributing to that growth. But we also see improved feed gas supply availability at some of the legacy producers, which includes Angola, Nigeria, but also, very importantly, Malaysia. So I think it is important to note that yes, we have a very steep reduction in LNG export flows from the Middle East, but 2/3 of these losses are offset by a very strong increase in LNG supply from other producing regions. If you look at the third bar here, it shows that piped gas imports from Norway, from North Africa, but also from Russia have been increasing primarily to the European market. And this is also contributing to the softening of the effect of the supply shock. And when we are looking at the demand side, here we are showing that natural gas consumption in the European market has remained broadly flat, a slight decline we see primarily because of the stronger expansion of renewables, which is weighing on gas burn in the power sector. But I think very importantly, and we will discuss this in the third part of the presentation, we see quite some demand response coming from the Asian markets, primarily on the back of gas to coal switching dynamics in the power sector, but also reduced supplies to some of the gas-intensive industries, such as fertilizers. Now, of course, prices have reacted swiftly to this supply disruption. And when we look back to March of this year, we have seen a very significant volatility with both the European TTF and the Asian JKM reaching their highest monthly averages since January 2023, which has been still very much a crisis period. So I think that we have seen both TTF and JKM moderating down throughout the April and the June period. In a way, they have been in a wait-and-see mode after the announcement of the ceasefire agreement in the beginning of April. And we have seen further downward pressure on prices since the announcement of the Islamabad Memorandum, which fueled hope that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened. Now, with the renewed geopolitical tensions, we have seen that both TTF and JKM increased by more than 35% since end of June, and today both of them are at their highest level since end of March of this year. So TTF is trading above $18 per MMBTU, and JKM prices are nearing $20 per MMBTU. I think a third element I would like to draw your attention on this chart is the gray area, which is the spread between TTF and JKM prices. JKM did display on average a premium of over $2 per MMBTU compared to TTF since the beginning of March. And of course, this helped Asian markets to attract more flexible LNG cargoes, and as such to offset some of the declines in supply. Tighter supply fundamentals and higher natural gas prices are of course having an impact also on consumption patterns. And here we are showing our first estimates for a number of selected Asian gas markets. When we look at the region in total, are estimated that natural gas consumption fell by approximately 4% during the March to May period compared to last year. In China, apparent natural gas demand fell by 4%. And this has been driven partly by gas to coal switching dynamics, but also importantly by storage movements, meaning less storage injections since the beginning of April compared to last year. And Frederick will, of course, provide more insights on that. We have seen a dramatic reduction in natural gas consumption in Pakistan, which is the country which is probably the most exposed actually to the supply disruption via the Strait of Hormuz, because in 2025, Pakistan imported 98% of its LNG from Qatar. And as such, we see a reduction in natural gas demand of over 20%, partly driven by gas to coal switching dynamics in the power sector, but also lower gas supplies to the fertilizer sector. In India, which is also quite exposed to that supply disruption, we have seen a decline in natural gas demand of around 10% year-on-year over the March to May period. And once again, this has been driven both by switching to coal and also lower natural gas deliveries to the industrial sectors. We have also seen decline in natural gas demand in Japan, and this is very much underpinned by more use of coal at the expense of regasified LNG. In Bangladesh, our estimate is that natural gas demand declined by around 5%, once again driven by switching to coal and also lower fertilizer production. And then we have the exceptions, Korea, where we have seen some natural demand growth driven by subdued nuclear availability. And also in Thailand, when our estimate indicate a quite strong increase of 7% in natural gas demand, also driven by the power sector. Now, this chart just illustrates the scale of the switching from natural gas to coal. Our first estimates indicate that during the March to May period in this selection of countries, gas-fired power generation fell by more than 10 terawatt hours. And we also see here that coal-based generation increased by more than that, by around 25 terawatt hours. And this partly reflects the fact that electricity consumption continued to increase in the region, but it is also reflective of the subdued nuclear availability in Korea and also to a certain extent in Japan. The elephant in the room, which is missing here, is China, and the reason for that is that at the moment there is no available data on on the split in China's thermal generation between coal and gas-fired power plants, but there is anecdotal evidence that gas-to-coal switching is happening, especially in the coastal provinces of the country. Now, looking at the European context, our estimate is that Europe's LNG imports fell by approximately 10% year-on-year during the March to June period. And on this chart, we are showing some of the drivers behind these lower LNG imports. One of them is the somewhat lower consumption, but as mentioned previously, we see a continued expansion of renewables, which is weighing on gas demand in the power sector. But I have to say that the demand reduction has been rather limited in Europe so far. But which plays quite a more significant role is the slower injection rates. So the less gas which is put into underground storage, and of course negative seasonal price spreads are playing an important role in why we see less gas being put into storage facilities. Another element to consider is the lower piped gas exports from the European Union to Ukraine, which is partly due to the weaker demand in the country, but also supported by the fact that the Ukrainian gas storage levels are actually above their last year levels. So there is less injection needs in Ukraine compared to last year. It is also important to note that we have seen more pipe gas deliveries coming to the European market from Russia, from North Africa, from Norway. And this is partly driven by upward nominations on the long-term contracts, but also potentially by higher spot procurements from these pipeline suppliers. And then a factor which is actually playing against these dynamics and would in principle support more LNG imports is the continued reduction in domestic natural gas output in Europe. And this is very much driven by the declines we see in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands. And these declines are outweighing the production growth in Denmark and in Turkey. So I think that just to summarize here is that since the Middle East crisis, we have seen Europe's LNG imports plummeting by 10% year-on-year, and of course this is a clear reverse of the trend we have seen over the winter season when Europe's LNG imports rose to an all-time high. Now, a couple of words on the EU storage dynamics. In the first chart on this slide, we are showing that seasonal price spreads on TTF have been averaging at minus 1.2 euro per megawatt hours since the beginning of April, which marks the start of the injection season in Europe. And of course, these negative price spreads have been reducing the commercial incentive for storage injections. And this is reflected by the fact that filling rates have been standing 17% below their last year levels since the start of April. And when we are looking at current storage levels, of course, it is good news that we overpassed the 50% threshold, but we are currently standing about 23% below the 5-year average, or 16 billion cubic meters below the 5-year average in absolute terms. And if the storage injection rates return to their 5-year average starting from tomorrow. Even in that case, the European Union would be able to fill up its underground storages just to about 75% of their working capacity. And this would be below the 80 to 90% storage fill target, but it would be also the lowest fill levels since 2013. So this means that if the European Union wants to reach its 80 to 90% fill target, then injection rates need to accelerate in the second half of the summer. And this, of course, would also support a more fierce competition for flexible LNG cargoes with Asia, because this would require more LNG coming to the European market. And with that, I would like to move to our short-term outlook for 2026. And I think, Charlie, you mentioned in your introductory remarks that our working assumption for this forecast is that there will be a gradual restart of LNG flows through the Strait of Hormuz in the third quarter, and we will see a ramp up to full operations at the non-damaged trains by the beginning of the fourth quarter of 2026. I just really would like to highlight that this is a working assumption. And under that working assumption, global LNG supply would remain broadly flat in 2026. But I also would like to highlight that any delays to that would push global LNG supply into contraction. And this is shown on the second chart of this slide, where we show that disruption which would last until the end of 2026 would actually result in the steepest decline in annual global LNG supply in the history of the LNG industry. So that would translate into a decline of between 10 to 15 billion cubic meters. And of course, this would provide upward pressure on prices and would result in a somewhat more tight winter market conditions. When we are looking at the demand side, our forecast for 2026 is that global gas consumption will fall by 0.5% or 20 billion cubic meters. And this would be the third annual decline in global gas demand since 2020. And as we can see on this chart, this decline is very much driven by the disruption caused in the Middle East to local supply and local industrial demand. In our forecast, Middle Eastern natural gas consumption declines by approximately 4%, which would be the steepest decline in the region's natural gas demand since the early 1990s. And once again, this is driven by the demand destruction induced by the disruption caused to local supply infrastructure and local industrial facilities. We also expect that natural gas demand in Asia will decline by 0.5% as higher LNG import prices are driving gas-to-core switching dynamics in the power sector and are also weighing in operating rates in gas-intensive industries. In Europe, our expectation is that natural gas demand will decline by around 2.5%, driven by the continued expansion of renewables, but also the relatively high spot LNG prices are also playing into that. In North America, after a rather mild Q1, we expect that demand will slightly decline compared to 2025, but this is essentially broadly flat. In Africa, we do expect a marginal increase in natural gas consumption driven by the power sector, and also we do expect that natural gas demand in Central and South America will increase by almost 3%, driven by lower hydro availability, which is, of course, supporting stronger gas burn in the power sector. And last but not least, in Eurasia, after rather cold Q1, we expect that natural gas demand will increase by approximately 3%, and this will partially offset the declines we see in other parts of the world. But of course, this is not sufficient to offset the full decline, and as such, we do expect an overall decline of 0.5% for 2026. I also would like to note that the current crisis is having implications on the medium-term outlook. And on this chart, we are presenting the cumulative impact of the supply disruption over the 2026-2030 period. If you look at the first bar, it shows that we already lost about 35 billion cubic meters of LNG supply from Qatar and the Emirates over the March to June period. On the second bar, we show that if we assume a restart of full operations at the non-damaged trains by Q4, this would also result in losses compared to the average operating rates of the trains. But very importantly, there are two trains at Ras Laffan which have been damaged, and their repair period has been estimated by QatarEnergy to be between 3 and 5 years. So our assumption here is that it would take approximately 4 years to bring back them to the market. And of course, this would translate into a loss of approximately 60 billion cubic meters. And last but not least, the North Field East expansion projects is now expected to be delayed by about 1 year, which further reduces the available LNG supply over the 2026-2030 period. So when we combine together all these losses, we have they total to approximately 140 billion cubic meters of cumulative LNG supply lost over the 2026-2030 period. And these losses are very much concentrated in 2026 and 2027, and as such, they do delay the full effect of the unfolding LNG wave by around 2 years. But I also would like to put into perspective what 140 billion cubic meters means. This equates to roughly 15% of the expected new cumulative LNG supply coming to the market over the 2026-2030 period. And as such, the new LNG supply which is coming to the market from the United States, from Canada, from Africa, but also from the Middle East, will offset the losses we see from Qatar and the Emirates. And this, of course, will provide downward pressure on prices and will help to ease up market conditions towards the end of the decade. I also would like to note that we have seen new LNG FIDs taking place since the beginning of March, with 3 projects reaching final investment decision in the United States, including CP2 Phase 2, Commonwealth LNG, and Delfin FLNG, one with a combined capacity of approximately 30 billion cubic meters. When we consider nameplate capacity, peak production capacity is, of course, somewhat higher than that. And this highlights the importance of adequate investments in the LNG value chain, and also reflects the supportive regulatory framework we have in the United States, which is also helping to make these final investment decisions and contribute to a well-balanced growth of the global gas and LNG market. And with that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Frederick Witter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Gergely. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Good morning to everyone. So following up on this introduction and run through of what's been happening in the markets and feeling the pulse of the market, as Gergely mentioned, in these next few slides, I just want to dive into the Asian markets to better understand how Asia has been helping or what role it's been playing in balancing the market. And for this, I just want to step back into the LNG picture for a few moments. What we see is that before March, global LNG market, or the global LNG market, was essentially growing for about 13 consecutive months of year-on-year growth in delivered volumes. North American liquefaction projects accounted for the overwhelming share of this incremental trade. This is something that we've already brought up. This is the red that we see in the chart, so the red columns. But of course, this growth streak was cut short by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, which in 2025 accounted for about 20% of global LNG supply. So quite a significant share of global delivered LNG. Now in March, the market turned to year-on-year decline as loadings from Qatar and the UAE essentially stopped in that period, although cargoes that had already been loaded in February were being delivered throughout the month of March. And with most of these cargoes delivered by the end of March, what we see is that the year-on-year decline in supply and delivered supply was even greater in April. But the net negative effect on the markets eased in both May and both June, and that's the black line that we see here. And this is thanks to 2 things that we've already talked about a little bit. The first is that Qatar continued to supply some volumes within the Persian Gulf to Kuwait, and that we saw an increasing number of Qatari and UAE vessels that were able to actually exit the Strait of Hormuz. We've heard about this quite a bit, often turning off their tracking signals and using routes that are either closer to Iranian or closer to Omani shores to get out of the Gulf. The second factor here is the ramp up of new liquefaction projects, which is still ongoing today. The growth from new projects has not stopped. And this is a central element to explaining why gas prices, as we saw in earlier slides, are maybe not higher than they are today, although we've been seeing some extra upward pressure in the past week or 2. Now, we'd be in a very different market context if we did not have these new incremental volumes actually coming to markets over this year. The result is that by June, the net negative impact on the market was only around 1.5 BCM year on year, and that for the first half of the year, global LNG deliveries, again, I'm speaking here in terms of delivered volumes, were still up by around 2.5 BCM year on year. Now, this is a bit of a look at the anatomy of the supply side shock, but just as importantly, we need to answer the question of how the market is actually balancing, and this requires us to look on the next slide into the demand side. With global LNG market, having grown by far less than what was previously expected, how did things actually balance out? And in the past, what we see is that Europe and Asia have alternated a balancing role for the global LNG market. And in recent years, essentially, one region has grown its LNG imports at the expense of the other. They have not increased their imports simultaneously in any given year. We'll focus first here on Asia, and what we're showing is the year-on-year change in LNG imports across Asia by individual market or market segments. Asian LNG imports were essentially recovering in late 2025 from more complicated dynamics in the earlier part of 2025. So despite what we saw as an acceleration in global LNG growth, supply growth in 2025, Europe was taking in pretty much all of these incremental volumes to satisfy a tighter European balance. So we were expecting further acceleration of LNG supply growth to drive import growth across both Asia and Europe in 2026. And this is what we started seeing at the beginning of the year in January and February. But of course, instead, what we see is that Asia had a sharp and immediate pullback from the market. This is where the majority of Qatari and UAE volumes were actually going before the crisis. So these are the markets that had to find alternative supply to their lost volumes. China was the single largest balancing market here, pulling back from the market significantly in March and April, before Japan and Korea eased up their purchasing in April, as we see by the green zone in this chart. Now, what we see is that by May, it was clear that dynamics were somewhat changing. Asian imports were still declining year on year, but by much less than in the previous 2 months. And then what we see is that supply was also easing in that period, or the downturn in supply was somewhat easing, as we saw in the previous chart. And by June, Asian LNG imports were back into growth territory. But we know that global delivered supply was still negative year on year in June. So these extra LNG volumes in terms of growth in Asia in June were necessarily being pulled from other markets. Now, on this next slide, we've overlaid the same metric for Europe with this red line. While Asia reacted very quickly and significantly to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz in March, what we see is that the European pullback from the market was somewhat slower in unfolding, still significant in March, but somewhat slower in unfolding. But what we see is that European imports kept widening their year-on-year deficit in both May and June, acting as this primary, or taking the baton in a sense of the role of primary demand-side balancing force by the end of the second quarter, and essentially failing to attract volumes that Asia was ready to pay for, which is something that we see or that we saw earlier in the price chart presented by Gergely. Now, what we see is that in tight market conditions, essentially competition between the Atlantic and Pacific basin reemerges very quickly, and balancing the market comes down to one region outbidding the other. Now, to dive a little bit more into some of these markets, I want to turn to China on the next slide. What we see is that in much of 2025, Chinese demand was on the rise, but growth was slightly tapering and has continued to taper into the first half of 2026. We still see organic drivers of demand growth being active, but a tight supply situation has weighed on domestic dynamics. What we see in the chart on the right, we have the supply picture. Domestic production growth has essentially slowed from around 5 to 6% in 2025 year on year to about half of that in most months so far this year, plus a decline in 1 or 2 months, which has significantly cut Q2 growth in domestic production. We see this as stemming mostly from a sort of technical and resource-based factors, as exploration and production activity essentially comes up against some natural barriers to growth before other resource basins are tapped, or the output to these new frontiers in a sense actually come online. Pipeline imports, which were also a reliable growth factor in recent years, are also flat and actually slightly negative thus far this year, as no new pipelines are coming online. New pipelines from the past couple of years are already at capacity. And then what we see in red is LNG imports declining too, matching with what we saw in an earlier chart. Now, what explains the difference between the supply and demand pictures, particularly in the first half of 2026 in Q1 and Q2, are essentially storage movements, with a lot more reliance on withdrawals in Q1 than last year, and then lower injections into storage in Q2 than last year. So essentially softening the balance through a bit of supply or storage movements. We're not showing the forecasts here, but I think these charts do give us some useful signposts to think about the future for China the rest of this year. While LNG imports are down in the first half of the year, alternative supply dynamics seem relatively tight. That's pipeline imports and domestic production, which means that any potential positive developments in terms of demand in the second half of the year, not necessarily returning to significant growth, but maybe just meeting natural backstops in the system to how far demand dynamics can soften. This means that any positive development in this respect would likely translate into a greater pull on the LNG market, just because the rest of the supply side picture is quite tight for this market. On the next slide, I think India gives us another view into this overall Asian picture. It's not as big of a market as China in terms of LNG or gas demand overall, but it has historically been a rather price-sensitive LNG buyer, particularly stemming from a number of energy and gas-intensive industries and sectors. This includes refining, petrochemicals, fertilizer production. These are points that Gary brought up a bit earlier. With Europe pulling strong on the LNG market in 2025, what we see is that India was one of those countries in Asia that had somewhat retreated from the spot LNG market, in a sense, in the first half of the year. This had an impact on Indian gas demand, as we see in the chart on the left. We're showing year-on-year change in gas demand by month. In the second half of the year of 2025, the global LNG balance was somewhat easing, and Indian gas demand dynamics started improving again over this period, with demand turning to growth again in late 2025 and early 2026. But we know that this recovery was, in a sense, cut short by the Hormuz crisis. With less LNG available, Indian gas demand plummeted in March, April, and May, even as the government introduced consumer protections for the city gas distribution sector. We see in the chart on the left how this has continued to grow in recent months. These are the blue bars that are above zero. The other part of the story is the domestic production factor in India in the chart on the right. What we're seeing is uninterrupted decline in domestic production since mid-2024. And this is a significantly constraining factor. Echoing some of the points that I made on China earlier, what we see is that this signals that LNG is the only supply-side option that can feasibly respond to any demand-side developments, again, in the Indian markets. And this is what we saw a couple of slides earlier, as India is one of those Asian markets that is returning to LNG import growth in May and June. And so looking forward, this gives us an idea of the sort of pressure that these markets can put or could put on the market, given that domestic production is constrained. Now, I want to wrap up with a quick slide on the short-term outlook for 2026. We expect Asian demand to fall by around 0.5 percentage point year on year in 2026, with the decline spread out across most of the markets in the region and across most sectors as well. The tighter LNG balance, of course, is a key factor in this decline, but this doesn't mean that Asian buyers are completely out of the markets. What we see is that we continue to expect cross-basin competition for LNG cargoes to remain relatively high, particularly given the fact, as I've highlighted for both India and China, the fact that domestic production dynamics are somewhat weak in the region. And this is set to impact market conditions for European buyers as well throughout much of the year. And I just want to highlight this sort of give and take scenario where tight market conditions are leading to this decline in demand, but ultimately there can be backstops to how far demand declines. And this in turn can lead to Asia remaining a strong buying force, or at least a competitive force in the LNG market. So I'll hand it over back to Gergely here.
Thank you, Frederick. Dear colleagues, we would like to close this presentation with a couple of concluding remarks. So indeed, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz represents an unprecedented supply shock to the global LNG market. However, it is important to note that we are also at a moment of historic new LNG supply growth, and this helps to offset approximately 2/3 of the losses from the Strait of Hormuz. Natural gas prices, both in Asia and in Europe, have been, of course, reacting swiftly to the supply disruption, and we have seen both TTF and JKM displaying a very volatile profile in March, and with both TTF and JKM rising to their highest Q2 averages since 2022. And renewed geopolitical tensions in the Middle East are today driving up again Asian and European spot prices. Now, this higher spot gas price environment is also supporting gas to coal switching dynamics and is weighing on natural gas demand across the LNG importing markets of Asia. When we are looking at the European context, we see that LNG imports have been declining by around 10% year-on-year since the beginning of March, and these lower LNG inflows are weighing on storage injections. Even if the European Union would return to the 5-year average injection rates, this would suffice only to fill up storages up to around 75% of working capacity by the 1st of November, and this would be below the European Union's 80 to 90% fill target, and this would be also the lowest fill levels since 2013. When looking at our short-term forecast for 2026, the working assumption of this forecast is that LNG flows from the Gulf will gradually restart in Q3, and they will reach full operations. The non-damaged trains in Qatar and the Emirates will reach full operations by the start of the fourth quarter of the year. And this would mean that global energy supply would remain broadly flat, although I would like to highlight that any delays to that timeline would push global energy supply into contraction for the first time since 2012. Now, we do expect that the tighter supply fundamentals will drive global gas demand into a decline of 0.5% in 2026, and this would be the third contraction this decade. And losses are largely concentrated in the Middle East due to the supply disruption and also to the destruction in demand in Asia as well as Europe. When we are looking at the Asian LNG imports, we do expect them to slightly increase in 2026, despite the tight supply conditions and relatively high prices. And this also highlights the increasingly important role of LNG in the region's energy mix and supply security. Just would like maybe to note that Pakistan is currently paying more than $20 per MMBTU for LNG, and this really shows that this fuel became a necessity to ensure electricity supply security across these markets. The Middle East conflict is also having implications on the medium-term outlook. We estimate that the cumulative losses from the disruption total to 140 billion cubic meters over the 2026-2030 period. And this is, of course, delaying the full effect of the unfolding LNG wave by around 2 years, meaning that the market will remain tighter for longer than previously expected. Dear colleagues, we would like to thank you for your attention, and we very much looking forward to continue with you this dialogue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerge and Frederick. The figures shows that the shock has been absorbed so far, but at a significant cost. Additional supply elsewhere replaced roughly 3/4 of the missing Gulf volumes. At the same time, prices rose, cargoes were diverted, demand was curtailed, coal use increased, and European storage remained well below average. The key question is therefore not only whether the system kept working, but how resilient it really is and who ultimately bears the cost of that resilience. And a special thanks for your creative slide titles. My favorite was It is 50 in the house regarding the EU storage demands. So thank you very much, Gerge and Frederick, for these valuable insights. And some last words in German. Der Report zeigt sehr deutlich, dass Versorgungssicherheit keine statische Größe ist. Ein Markt kann auf dem Papier ausreichend versorgt sein und dennoch binnen weniger Tage unter erheblichen Druck geraten, wenn eine zentrale Route oder Produktionsregion ausfällt. Die europäische und deutsche LNG-Infrastruktur bleibt deswegen unverzichtbar. Sie schafft Zugang zum globalen Markt und ermöglicht es, Ausfälle auszugleichen. Zugleich bedeutet dieser Zugang aber auch eine stärkere Abhängigkeit von globalen Preisen, geopolitischen Risiken und der Nachfrage in Asien. Ein ganz herzlicher Dank nochmal an Gerge Mollner und Frederik Ritter für Ihre Einblicke und danke auch an Sie, liebe Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer, für Ihr Interesse. Und damit wünsche ich Ihnen einen guten Start ins Wochenende und freue mich, wenn Sie auch bei unserem nächsten Webinar wieder mit dabei sind. Bis dahin, auf Wiedersehen.